Splat!
So my name is Nick Cusworth, and I was the lead designer on Croc, Legend of the Gobbos, and Croc 2. So I joined Argonaut in 1993, and the first game I worked on was Vortex for Super Nintendo with Super FX chip. Um, Croc came, I think we started about probably 95. I'd worked on a couple of other things for Argonaut within that time. I'd mentioned Creature Shock Deluxe. There was like a Scooby-Doo game, um, a game that never came out, which was very interesting. But then, so Croc was probably like the fourth thing that I'd worked on at Argonaut, and so my introduction to Croc came fairly early on. Jez had obviously demoed the Yoshi demo to Nintendo. And I was working on a project called Creature Shock Deluxe, which was taking the PC game Creature Shock, putting it on the Saturn and putting it on the PlayStation. While we were doing that, Tony and Lewis were working on some tech demos on the Saturn. And that just so happened to be the sort of early days of Croc. There was kind of this very chubby little crocodile running down these kind of snowy pipes. I seem to remember as my memory's not too great on it, but that's when I was first introduced to it. And then when the Creature Shock project ended, we sort of got talking. We had a load of ideas, and we were like, "Do you want to join the team?" And at that point, it was probably only like 3 or 4 people, if that. So my initial focus on the project was to really kind of establish what sort of game we wanted to make. We knew obviously it wanted to be a 3D platformer, but we didn't really know how to make that at all. So a lot of the early discussions with Tony and Lewis were really about what tools do we need to build this game? How are we going to take what's traditionally been a 2D format of video game platformer and turn it into a 3D platformer? And that led to kind of the Croc editor, which was used across a whole bunch of different projects, and also the scripting language that we developed, which again kind of had this lineage. I think it was a conversation I'd had with Dylan during the Star Fox days of how they put that together, and they had a very, very simple scripting language. It was basically machine code. So like a hexadecimal value followed by a hexadecimal value. Then for Creature Shock Deluxe, we kind of took that idea and we kind of took it a level up. So it was more like assembly language. It was, again, very simple. But then for Croc, we developed this scripting language, which was called ASL, Argonaut Scripting Language. And that was far more powerful. That was like a sort of human readable scripting language with which like the vast majority of the game was built in. I think the only thing moving in the game that wasn't scripted in the scripting language was Croc, who was hard coded. So a lot of those early discussions were really about how are we going to build this? And the editor came about because, we were looking at, well, how do you build a 2D platformer? And it's a whole bunch of different tiles. So the thought was, well, why don't we take that, extrapolate it into 3D? So you're basically, instead of building on a flat plane, you're building it within inside a cube. And that's how we'll build our maps. So we effectively, we used to call these sections of the level track pieces or tile pieces. And they slotted together the same way a 2D platform game would be put together, but in 3D within inside this cube. So really a lot of the early days of Croc were how are we going to build this, and what does a 3D platformer actually play like and feel like to play? I remember the idea of a 3D platformer was floated around even during the Super FX times, but the limited amount of polygons that you could push around on the Super FX chip made that kind of like a hard problem to solve. So when the PlayStation and the Saturn came about, it kind of allowed us a little bit more flexibility to think about what that might actually look like as a 3D platformer. But there really was no point of reference. Obviously, games kind of came out a few during the development of Croc, and obviously many after. With Mario 64, of course, being the main one. But we didn't have really any sense of what anybody else was doing at the time. So every single problem that we faced, every single decision that we made was kind of, it felt kind of pioneery. It was the first time we were really tackling some of these problems, even though Argonaut has a great history of doing 3D games. I mean, it barely did any 2D games. It was birthed in 3D. So even with all of experience within the company, this sort of challenge of trying to translate a 2D platformer into 3D, yeah, it was. I wish I could remember specifics or any eureka moments. I don't think there really were any. It was kind of this gradual process of trial and error and trying different things. And like the camera is a huge part of that. And we had no real idea how to do a camera for a 3D platformer. And what we had in Croc worked with the control system that we had, but obviously, anybody who's played any more modern platformers, the camera in Croc is really quite primitive. And it was something that when Mario 64 came out, it was kind of like a bit of a shock because they'd kind of solved the camera first time out of the bat. And yeah, it was something that we struggled with a lot on Croc 1 and on Croc 2. Yeah, I mean, looking back on Croc, there is a lot of variety, and there's a lot of different characters in there, and they all do a unique thing, which is really nice. In terms of what we could draw on screen, again, this was kind of really a discovery of what the hardware was able to do. We did set a hard limit on the distance of the worlds because anything beyond it, we were running into performance issues. I think the characters were of such low polygon counts that actually they weren't the main challenge. The main challenge really was environmental. And I think that the strong designs that Simon Keaton came up with and Peter Day came up with for the enemies and for Croc allowed sort of like really strong silhouettes in very low numbers of polygons. So really the characters, I don't seem to remember the characters ever being something that limited what we were able to push. It was mainly the world. That's why there's quite a lot of height in the worlds in Croc because it was draw distance that was our real problem. It was what the camera could see and how far into the distance the camera could see, not so much height. So one of the conscious decisions we had with Croc was that we wanted to build worlds. There are other PlayStation titles out there that kind of played to the strengths of the system, sort of streaming in geometry as you're going down a path, keeping the camera very focused, making sure that everything the camera could see was within a poly limit budget. We didn't really want to do that. We wanted a true open world, and we played to the strengths of the PlayStation in a different way. So whereas something like the Nintendo 64 is brilliant at drawing huge polygons, which is why you can get those vast worlds in Mario 64, the PlayStation was really good at drawing textures, which is why the world of Croc is very textural. I mean, there's texture rich. There's a lot of detail in there. It still looks really quite impressive in terms of detail for the amount of textures that are just all over these worlds and making them look really distinct. So we could have possibly taken an approach where we kind of played to the limitations of this sort of draw distance limitation of the PlayStation, but we decided to create more solid, interesting, unique, intricate worlds, and we limited them by containing them to certain dimensions, and then each level you'd go through a door to go into basically the next section of the game, which I think ultimately is part of the charm of the game. We saw it as a limitation at the time, but in talking to people that played the game and loved the game, it's actually something that we really appreciate because every single room feels like a challenge, and there's like almost a puzzle to solve, or there's something to solve within that room. And once you've done it, you can move on, you go through the door, and it's the next set of challenges there. So what actually we thought was a limitation ended up being kind of a fundamental part of the enjoyment of playing the game, which is really interesting. Yeah, in terms of the world, there was a lot of thought put into them, but ultimately we kind of fell back on some tropes. You've got the kind of the forest world, the ice world, the desert world, and then the castle. But you have to kind of put that in the context of all the other problems that we were trying to solve at the time. And it's like there's certain boundaries on how far you can kind of push things. So we felt this sort of safety in these very distinct worlds that had very distinct palettes. So it was clear when you went from one island to the next that something different was going to be there. And with the ice, yeah, the ice still looks really beautiful. And I distinctively remember as well. I think it's in the final boss arena with Baron Dante, there's like a stained glass window and the light reflects onto the arena floor. And that was all done by hand. I remember the day walking in and just seeing it that day. And I think that was Mick that did that. And it was just, whoa, that's a sort of beautiful artistic touch that is completely faked but looks so convincing, and especially for a PlayStation, it looks brilliant. So looking at the scripting language, it was almost a blueprint for how game engines work now. It was a custom language, a syntax that we created ourselves, but its function was the same way some game engines, for example, use Lua or C Sharp. But what it allowed was designers, programmers, artists to have an idea, code up a simple script, get it in game almost immediately, try things out. And that was the beauty of the whole tool chain, to be honest. The level editor was so quick to try out ideas. You could basically build a whole level in a day. I'd often go home on a night, have an idea, come in the morning, build it, script it, and it would be done the next day. So that obviously took quite a long time into development to get the tools as refined as that, and to get the characters and the enemies and the scripting language and everything up to that point. But once we were running really fast because the tool chain, the pipeline, really allowed us to build everything really fast. So it'd been really interesting to see what would have happened had we stuck with the Croc engine outside of the PlayStation generation. Now, some of it was used. I think the scripting language was used on a number of projects at Argonaut, but it almost feels like this prototype kind of Unity or Unreal engine that we built. And it's like, it would have been very interesting to see what the end game for that would have been had we used it outside of PlayStation games, of which it powered quite a few. I think when people sit down and play the remaster, in a weird way, it's kind of going to be what they remember, because when the PlayStation seemed like it came from another planet when it first came out, and all of those games, they were just they blew you away, like playing Wipeout, or even things like Crash Bandicoot, or like Final Fantasy VII or Metal Gear Solid. I remember seeing Metal Gear Solid for the first time and just being like, this is a film. My jaw drops. You play it now and you see all of the technical limitations of the PlayStation. But with this remaster, this sort of like loving recreation of what we created back in the 90s, it just kind of takes away the stuff that can get in the way of playing, like the polygons popping and like the warping of the textures and things like that, and also like the complication of having to set up some weird way to play it, be it an emulator or a Mr. FPGA or whatever it is. So I would hope the players that pick it up feel like it was just yesterday, and that's exactly how they remember it. And I spent 10 years at Argonaut, 10 very happy years. It was a great company to work for. Jez was an awesome boss. And Croc was just one of those great projects with tons of creative freedom that you wouldn't get to make probably anywhere else. Jez allowed that environment of creativity, even though Jez is hyper focused on technology. And I know that every now and then he kind of like send me down to some warehouse in Ealing to go look at something that someone's doing. It's like, can you use this in a game? And it's like, I don't know, it's kind of crazy. Or like, I remember him showing me this physics engine demo, and he's like, can we do this in a game? And I'm like, I don't know how would you do it? It's so unpredictable. Physics it's like you need repeatability. He was always way ahead, looking at things that nobody else was looking at. And I kind of wish I'd stuck with it a little bit, because like the physics thing really sticks with me. It's like, how did he see before anybody else that physics was just going to be a fundamental part of like 3D games, when everybody else was just still in that mindset of like repeatability, predictability, sort of 2D mindset. So Jez was a real visionary when it came to technology, but also fantastic when it came to allowing space for creativity.